Good morning, this is Angela with Parkrose Permaculture. I have been working on spreading my wood chips. And I meant to do a video yesterday, but it was rainy and cold and I just stayed busy shoveling. So you can check out my previous videos, I'll link to them. These chips are from Chip Drop. They are a mix of coniferous wood chips and ramial wood chips. Significant portion of what I'm using in the paths is coniferous, and then I'm trying to preserve for the beds those deciduous wood chips. There's quite a bit of birch in here. This is a apple guild. You can see I've pruned this apple tree. Folks who may kind of give a little bit of side eye at the way I've pruned this tree. This is a partial tip bearer, so I do let it get a little bit lanky. Underneath it, I have morel spawn. And so I wanted to really concentrate a pretty thick layer of those ramial wood chips here. There's also things like dormant, rhubarb, peony, all kinds of dormant bulbs, things like that. And that gets to one of my primary comments about mulching with wood chips where you can get into trouble. Let's go over here and take a look because it also is true over there. Here you can see my rain garden. When you mulch with wood chips in the path, I go real deep. You can see my blue bottle wall here along the edge of my rain garden. These wood chips are probably 3 to 4 inches deep here. And I pile them all the way almost to the top of the bottle wall. That's fine. But when you use your wood chip mulch on existing perennial beds, you want to be really careful that you are not spreading it more than 1 to 2 inches deep. Sometimes 2 inches is too much. Here they're about 1 inch deep. You can see one of my Victoria rhubarbs is just starting to germinate. You don't want to smother those dormant perennials. I have in the past killed strawberries and violets and other dormant perennials by aggressively mulching too deep with my wood chips. So just as a cautionary tale, you want to mulch around the base of plants where you can see the existing crown of the plant. And if you are mulching over an area like this is just full of dormant perennials, the rhubarb takes up a lot of space, but I also have blue false indigo and there's a young tree peony here. There are a number of herbaceous, slow-growing perennials underneath here. I have put 1 inch or less of mulch. So you can see here's the good soil underneath because I don't want to smother those perennials. Around the base of trees, if I don't have anything, if I don't have any plants planted, I also don't want to get too aggressive with the mulch under the drip line of the tree. I will mulch, but I don't mulch all the way up to the trunk if I can help it. And I don't mulch super deep around that drip line. Those trees do want a layer of mulch, but they don't want 8 or 10 inch piles of mulch. Sometimes I see landscapers do that. I wanted to move that wheelbarrow out of the way. So this property had a buried concrete sidewalk going through it, which I discovered in the early years of living here because there were patches where things didn't grow very well. And about 8 to 10 inches down, there was a buried concrete sidewalk that went all the way back to my neighbor's property, all the way to the fence line, because this used to be the orchard for the house I live in. And the plot was subdivided by the previous owner and they built a house back here. But there used to be a walkway down to what I think might have been a well house or pump house and the orchard back on that property. So I have a lot of old urbanite that I just make use of what I have, and I've used it for my annual beds. But I've also been kind of doing lazy hugelkultur in that when I get free loads of wood off Craigslist for firewood, if something's real pithy and super rotten and not good for using for firewood, I will use it for the edges of beds, and it slowly decomposes. And like I said, kind of lazy hugelkultur. So here's my potato bed. I've dug all my potatoes. It's now ready to plant. I deepened this bed quite a bit by adding some duck manure And then you can see I used some old wood here to deepen the bed, and I removed the urbanite pieces. And then I mulched around it. And for me, when you are planting annual veggies, if you mulch around the edges of the bed, it is fantastic weed suppression, particularly if you put cardboard underneath the wood chips and then you mulch 3-4 inches deep. Right here where I'm standing in between these veggie beds, this is probably 6 inches of mulch. So it's great weed suppression around the edges of your beds. It also, again, provides that clear delineated pathway so kids and visitors know where your veggie beds are and where your paths are. I have designed these veggie beds, let me back up here, so that water from my pergola here falls into the rain garden. This is sloped downhill. This is my giant reservoir that holds my water instead of rain barrels. When this fills to the brim, there is a buried channel here and it overflows, and this is all downhill. And what you get is a gentle downhill cascade of water to these 6 beds and this one over here as well, to my asparagus bed in the back. So I have buried gravel for drainage, have a downhill slope, but then I use thick mulch on top. And that is to help keep these areas from these paths, which serve as a channel for water. It keeps them from becoming boggy. The wood chips also absorb so much water as you go downhill with that water flow and hold it so that the roots of my annual veggies can capture that water. It keeps it around the edges of the bed. So that brings me to my second point for mulching wood chips. Great for weed suppression, particularly if you use cardboard underneath, but great for holding moisture against the soil. Great for capturing, sucking up water and holding it there. Let me show you. Wood chips, as they break down, become more and more and more spongy. And so these are my fresh wood chips. You can see it's been raining. They are just super wet, and the more they break down, the more these are like a sponge, and it can get to a point where I can squeeze it and you can just see all the water in it. And this is really great for any kind of garden where you are looking to conserve water, right? You want those wood chips to hold the water against the soil. Now, why don't I have wood chips straight on this bed here? Well, first of all, I'm dealing with replanting some of my baby perennial leeks and onions and things. And then you can see here the very tail end of my dwarf curly kale, which is one of my favorite winter kales. I actually was putting duck manure in this bed, and you can see deepening the bed. Some of my beds, I use wood chips directly on the veggie beds as a mulch, again, to hold moisture against the soil, to reduce water loss. Some of my beds I don't. And I think this is one place where folks can get, confused isn't the right word. They can take issue with using wood chips because it's not working for them in their annual veggie beds. If you are planting veggies, and I'm going to be planting lettuce here really soon, if you're planting veggies where the seeds need light to germinate, you can't be planting them under your mulch, right? So it doesn't work to use wood chip mulch in every situation where you're growing annuals, at least not initially, at least not when you're looking at germinating them. Oh, a bunch of dark-eyed juncos just flew into the yard. So for a bed like this, where my plants are going to need that bare soil and access to the sun in order to germinate, I'm not going to mulch yet. Later in the season, when those plants are established, I will add mulch around the beds in order to hold that moisture in, but not initially. Now, a bed like this, where I'm planning on growing tomatillos and things this year, I mulched in the fall when I added duck manure. You can see this mulch is already partially broken down compared to the fresh mulch that I just added in the paths. Breaks down really quickly because I live in a wet climate. With beds like this, the key to not having your wood chips reduce the fertility of your plants where they bind up nitrogen and make it unavailable to your plants is you don't plant in the wood chips. You plant through the wood chips, pull the wood chips apart, plant through into the good rich soil underneath, and then push the wood chips back around your seedling. When I see folks say wood chips are terrible because I end up with sickly yellow plants, I often see folks do one of two things. They plant in the wood chips and don't go all the way through into the soil underneath, or they till the wood chips into their soil. Both of those are big no-nos. Think of your wood chips as a covering, as a protective layer. Think of the forest where there is leaf fall and pine needle fall, and dead woody material makes a covering over the soil to protect it. Nature doesn't turn it into the soil in a uniform manner. Now, moles may do a little bit of heaving up earth up over your wood chips. I find as soon as I mulch with wood chips, within a few days, Mr. Moley is going to come and dig up a hole right in my path. That happens a lot. That's okay. But what you don't get is a uniform distribution of wood chips throughout your soil layer. So please don't till your wood chips into your garden beds. And please think about when you need a bed with open soil where your plants are gonna germinate better. Same thing for not planting your seedlings into your wood chips. You can't broadcast seeds on top of this material and expect them to do well. Now, let's say I wanted to sow seeds in this bed right now, which has got this decomposing woody material on it. I would take my hoe and I would pull back all of the wood chips to the edge of the bed. I would plant in this bed. Once they've germinated and reached a good enough size, I would push the mulch back around them. So I hope that fixes that issue for y'all. If y'all have yellow plants that clearly the wood chips are binding up nitrogen, those are two of the biggest reasons. So make sure you plant through the wood chips into the soil, and make sure you are not tilling your wood chips into your well-decomposed humus. So looking back over here over my rain garden, again, we can see I've mulched around everything. I really, really, really love using native coastal strawberries as a green living summer mulch. And I also really love white clover. And you can see these things are kind of dormant right now, and I want to be careful not to smother them. But again, in those paths, I heap it up real deep. Now, as the wood chips break down in the paths and turn into soil, those nutrients sift around in your garden. Those nutrients are moved by water, by creatures in the soil. So when we are adding fertility in the paths here, that fertility can reach the roots of the plants adjacent. So don't think of using wood chips in the path as a waste. It's not a waste of biomass. Anytime you are adding biomass to your garden, you are increasing the fertility of the entire system, okay? Even though it's not directly in a bed where you're growing things. Also, you are adding more of a substrate and more of a food source for good fungal life and good microbial life of your soil. I've talked in the past about how our fruit trees, you can look at my muddy, you can see I've let the chickens and ducks in this part of the orchard, and they have done their job of absolutely muddying this up and making a big mess of all of the wood chips I added in the fall. And I'm about to kick them out and add another round of wood chips, and also leave some bare patches and seed with things that will be used as chicken feed later in the spring. But if you look in my orchard here, fruit trees really like a fungal dominated soil. They compete with grass, which likes a bacterially dominated soil. So when you are mulching with wood chips around your fruit trees, in your garden, you are encouraging a situation, you are encouraging a condition in your system that fosters fungal dominated soil, which is going to be good for your fruit trees and berry bushes and nut trees. Okay, so we've talked about some of those issues. Don't mulch too deeply with wood chips around your or over your low growing perennials. Don't plant into the chips directly. Plant through the chips into the soil. Don't till your chips into your soil. So since this is a little stream of consciousness and a little hodgepodge, let's keep moving over here. We're moving over to my woodshed where my akebia is starting to leaf out. Behind the woodshed, when we put this woodshed in, I felt bad that my neighbor had to look at a woodshed, so I planted an akebia along the fence so they would have beautiful purple pinky flowers to look at instead. So on the far side of the shed, that is starting to leaf out and I can't wait for it to bloom. It's an early bloomer. So let's talk about, besides the benefit of, particularly if you add cardboard, weed suppression, and the benefit we talked about a moment ago of trapping moisture against the soil, wood chips have a third added benefit, which is that they cool the soil. Anytime you are shading your soil from the intense rays of the sun, it's going to have a cooling effect. And when we look at our hot, dry summers, when we look at climate change, when we look at increasingly drought-ridden conditions, much of the west and southwest of the United States is expected to have a continuation of drought this year. Preventing water loss is incredibly important for your plants, but so is just cooling the soil in general. My video cut out on me there. So when we are shading the soil, we're cooling the roots of the plant, we're helping the plant get through a hot spell. Folks have asked me, does having wood chips attract slugs? And in my experience, it doesn't really. Things like cardboard mulch attract slugs. Having shady spots in general is going to attract slugs. That's why I have ducks. And also I hand pick slugs, and I have an upcoming video about one of the ways I passively trap slugs and remove them from my garden. So that will be coming up soon. And by removing them, I mean after I trap them, I feed them to my ducks because they are a resource. Slugs become yummy, yummy duck eggs. So in our gardens, when we use wood chips, we're looking at the slow, passive way of adding fertility to the soil as the wood chips break down and eventually become humus. It can take anywhere from 9 months to 5 years, depending on the conditions of your site. Again, it's very wet here a lot of the winter and not very cold, and therefore decomposition is still happening at a pretty good rate, a pretty good clip all winter long. So my chips don't last as long. So we're looking at that added long-term benefit of the slow release fertilizer of our chips. We're looking at, so that's one. Two, we're looking at a substrate for growing things like morel mushrooms, for Stropharia rugosa annulata mushrooms, so edible mushrooms, and mushrooms that are not edible, beneficial mycelium, which help create a good soil ecology, a good soil situation for our fruit trees. So there's two. Three, we're looking at shading the soil and cooling it. Four, we're looking at reduced water loss and actually water capture, which are sort of two different things. Grabbing the water, holding it, slowly releasing it back into the soil, and then preventing it from evaporating in the first place. And we're looking at weed suppression. And lastly, I would say, as someone with kids and dogs, we are looking at reduced muddiness, reduced erosion, reduced mess in the garden when we use wood chips. So I hope that that gives y'all a look, a little rambly, at some of the do's and don'ts for wood chips and some of the many benefits